I was at an upscale dinner party recently, seated across from a man who makes his living at a top-tier international NGO. Between sips of an expensive Bordeaux, he was holding court on the absolute moral bankruptcy of Europe's new immigration laws. To him, the 2026 return hubs weren't just policy, they were a civilizational sin. He spoke with a practiced airy grace about universal dignity and the erasure of borders, as if he were discussing a high-concept art installation. He seemed to float above the mundane reality of the state, fueled by a deep-seated conviction that his compassion was the only metric that mattered. But then, the host, perhaps a bit mischievously, brought up a local news rumor. A temporary migrant processing center was being considered for the vacant community lot just 3 blocks from this very townhouse. The transformation was clinical. The airy grace vanished, replaced by a rigid, twitching defensiveness. He didn't mention universal dignity again. Instead, he started listing very specific concerns about global security protocols, zoning violations, and the unfortunate impact on the neighborhood's social fabric. In less than 60 seconds, the borderless idealist had become a frantic border guard of his own zip code. He wasn't arguing from principle anymore. He was reacting from an instinctual, almost primal need for order. That instantaneous collapse, the moment a luxury belief is punctured by a needle of reality, is exactly what we are witnessing on a continental scale right now. The EU's offshore hubs and the UK's new income floors aren't just right-wing pivots, they are the involuntary spasms of a system that has finally run out of other people's security to spend. We are moving past the era of high-minded extractions and into a cold, hard diagnosis of societal physics, an attempt to repair the social contract before the entire structure succumbs to systemic suicide.
Right, and just to establish the precise framework for you, the listener, right at the outset, it's really necessary to address the intensity of the perspective that was just outlined there.
Absolutely.
Because the highly charged political viewpoints, along with these specific diagnostic terms like anarcho-tyranny, luxury beliefs, systemic suicide, these represent the analytical frameworks driving the current European legislative shifts we're looking at.
Exactly.
We are explicitly not endorsing any left-wing or right-wing political positions today. We're not taking a moral side in this legislative conflict.
Right.
Rather, we are impartially unpacking a very specific functionalist diagnosis of the 2026 EU and UK immigration reforms. The objective for you is to examine the underlying sociological theories, the physical realities on the borders, and, well, the legal mechanics that have transformed continental policy.
So to jump right into that physical reality, I mean, the most immediate manifestation of this functionalist diagnosis is happening right now on the edges of Europe.
Yeah, the geographical edges.
Exactly. To understand how this systemic, almost autoimmune response is operating, we have to look at the Offshore Processing Hub.
Right, in Albania.
Yeah, in the rolling hills of Albania. It's completely detached from the European landmass, but it operates entirely under European legal jurisdiction.
Which is a massive shift.
It is. And inside this prefabricated, heavily secured office block where, the air perpetually smells of wet concrete and cheap espresso, sits an Italian administrative officer named Marcus.
Okay.
And his daily routine represents the precise execution of the systemic bypass we're talking about here, because for the better part of a decade, Marcus worked in Rome.
Right, in the domestic system.
Yeah, and during those years, he basically watched the entire apparatus of the state grind to a complete halt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, deportation orders would be drafted, signed, and then they'd immediately dissolve into this endless labyrinth of appeals. The domestic judicial system had become entirely paralyzed.
Because it was prioritizing abstract universalism over local law.
Exactly. It prioritized international human rights law over the enforcement of local sovereign law. The system could process the paperwork, sure, but it couldn't execute the physical removal of an individual.
So it's just paper pushing, basically.
Total paper pushing. But now, Marcus sits in Albania under the mandate of the 2026 Return Hub legislation. And the domestic courts of Italy, with their activist judges and injunctions, they have absolutely zero jurisdiction over the soil beneath his desk.
That's the crucial bypass right there.
Right. So on his monitor is a digital file for an applicant whose identity had already been lost 3 separate times in the European database.
Which used to mean they could just walk out.
Exactly. In the past, that individual would just walk out of a holding center and disappear into the suburbs of Rome or Milan. But today, the process is clinical. Marcus reviews the biometric mismatch, verifies the secondary origin data, and simply presses a button. The digital file moves instantly to the non-admissible queue.
Which triggers the mandate for a third country relocation.
Right. No multi-year appeal, no release into the local community. Marcus described it as having this hollow pit in his stomach when he executes these orders.
From the cruelty of it.
Actually, not from cruelty, but from this stark, sobering realization that for the European nation-state to survive, it had to actively outsource its own sovereignty.
Wow.
It had to build a fortress outside its own walls, completely untouched by the domestic humanitarian industrial complex. He views his work like a surgeon performing a necessary amputation in the middle of a blackout.
That's tense. And the legal architecture that enables Marcus to do that in Albania is, it's a really fascinating study in state survival mechanisms.
So,
Well, the 2026 EU Return Hub legislation isn't just a minor update to existing border protocols. It's a fundamental rewiring of European territorial law. At its core, the framework institutes common procedures for issuing return decisions across the entire bloc. It introduces this legally binding European return order.
which didn't exist before.
Yes. Previously, if, say, France ordered someone deported, but they crossed the border into Germany, the German authorities would often have to start a whole new multi-year legal process to enforce it.
Okay, so it resets the clock every time they cross a border.
Exactly. But the 2026 mandate establishes immediate mutual recognition across all EU member states. A decision made in one capital is instantly enforceable by the security apparatus of any other member state.
Without redundant judicial review.
Right. And it establishes expedited protocols for forced returns, especially for security risks. But the absolute linchpin of this entire apparatus is the establishment of those offshore processing centers in third countries, like the one Marcus is at in Albania.
And the text refers to this as the ICFication of European borders, right? Like the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Yes, drawing a direct parallel to the rigid enforcement seen in the United States.
Yeah.
But the critical diagnosis here is that these offshore hubs are not an innovation born of a desire for administrative efficiency. No, they are a deliberate geographic evasion, a surgical bypass. The functionalist analysis argues that the domestic legal apparatus of the European nation-state has been crippled by a radical ideological framework.
So the state is fundamentally impotent to execute its primary duty.
Exactly. Defending and enforcing its own sovereign borders. Which brings us to a concept that is absolutely central to understanding the rationale behind these 2026 policies.
Right. Anarcho-tyranny.
Yes. The analytical framework diagnoses this condition of state impotence as anarcho-tyranny.
And to break this down for you, the listener, anarcho-tyranny describes this deeply paradoxical state of governance.
Yes.
On one hand, you have the tyranny aspect.
Huh.
The state applies the law ruthlessly and meticulously and with overwhelming force to its own native, law-abiding citizenry.
Now, try building a shed without a permit.
Exactly. If you, as a citizen, fail to pay a fraction of your taxes, or if you violate a minor municipal zoning law, the state possesses the competence and the will to crush you financially and legally.
The bureaucratic machinery functions perfectly against the compliant core of society.
Perfectly. But simultaneously, you have the anarcho aspect. When dealing with individuals who violate the foundational premises of the state itself, namely crossing its sovereign borders illegally, the state suddenly becomes completely paralyzed.
It adopts a posture of absolute leniency.
Right. Or systemic incompetence. The state refuses, or is legally unable, to execute its basic function of territorial integrity. It allows anarchy at the macro level of national borders while enforcing tyranny at the micro level of daily civic life.
And that highlights a severe crisis of legitimacy for the nation-state.
Because the social contract fractures.
When the working population sees that the state is hyper-competent at extracting tax revenue from them, but entirely incompetent at preventing thousands of undocumented individuals from bypassing the legal immigration system.
Its trust is gone.
Yeah. The state is demanding the obligations of citizenship without providing the core benefit of citizenship, which is security and a stable community.
So the offshore hubs are a desperate attempt to fix this.
By moving the enforcement mechanism completely outside the domestic territory, the state evades the domestic legal architecture that mandates the anarchy side of the equation.
Because the activist lawyers and NGO injunctions that block deportations in Paris or Rome can't project their power into Albania.
They have no jurisdiction there.
You know, it's incredibly useful to look at this through the lens of a massive biological or technological system. Well, if you view the European Union or any sovereign nation as a biological organism, its internal regulatory system systems, the domestic courts, the national legislatures have essentially been compromised.
By a pathogen.
Right. And in this functionalist diagnosis, that pathogen is the ideological belief system that denies the fundamental necessity or morality of borders.
The technological analogy works well here, too.
Yeah, imagine a highly advanced computer network. This network is protected by a massive firewall, which represents the domestic legal system. But over time, activists and legal theorists have rewritten the fundamental code of that firewall. They've reprogrammed it so that it now views incoming unauthorized viruses not as threats, but as VIP guests who possess a universal right to access the mainframe.
Oh. So the internal security is paralyzed by its own code.
Completely. The system can't delete the malicious files because its own operating parameters dictate that every file has a fundamental right to exist within the network.
So what does the system do to survive?
The only way the operating system can survive, the only way it can process this massive influx of incoming data without crashing the entire hard drive, is to build a completely separate, external, physically isolated server.
The return hubs.
Exactly.
Yep.
The 2026 return hubs in Albania and elsewhere are that external server. The state routes all the incoming, ambiguous data to this isolated environment, screens it, and deletes the unauthorized files before they ever touch the main domestic network.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the functionalist mechanism at play here. Expanding on that, the offshore hub acts as an external antibody developed by a societal organism fighting off systemic collapse.
Because the internal mechanisms failed.
Totally failed. The domestic deportation flights, the internal holding centers, they were hijacked by universalist legal interpretations that made physical removal practically impossible.
But what about the massive backlash from human rights groups?
Well, the analytical framework we are unpacking views those warnings through a very specific lens. It doesn't view the NGO outrage as a principled defense of universal human rights.
What does it view it as?
It frames this advocacy as the maintenance of a moral luxury good.
Interesting.
The argument is that the ideology of a borderless world is a luxury enjoyed by a specific elite class. And crucially, this moral luxury is heavily subsidized.
Subsidized by who?
By the physical safety, the social trust, and the fiscal stability of the working class core of society.
Right, because the wealthy advocates for open borders aren't the ones living in the neighborhoods where social cohesion breaks down.
Exactly. They don't rely on overwhelmed municipal healthcare systems.
Right.
They don't compete for wages in a flooded labor market. They don't bear the immediate physical consequences of the anarcho-tyranny they perpetuate.
So the external hubs are just the macroeconomic system bypassing its own paralyzed organs to survive.
Regardless of the aesthetic outrage of the insulated upper class, yes.
You know, that theoretical concept of a subsidized luxury belief becomes starkly, brutally physical when we shift our focus from those bureaucratic processing centers to the actual external borders of Europe.
You're talking about the maritime borders.
Yeah. Specifically, Lampedusa, the Italian island that's basically been ground zero for the Mediterranean migration crisis.
Right.
Here, we observe the daily reality of Captain Elias, a veteran officer of the Italian Coast Guard. Picture him standing on the metal deck of a heavily armored patrol boat, just staring out at the moonlight reflecting off the Mediterranean Sea.
Edge.
And Elias has spent the better part of a decade watching progressive politicians, academics, and NGO directors signal their immense virtue from, comfortable television studios in Berlin and Paris.
Claiming open borders are the only moral path.
But Elias knows the actual mathematical reality of these luxury beliefs better than anyone in those studios. His physical reality is entirely divorced from their abstract theorizing.
Because of what he deals with on the water?
Yeah. He spent his afternoon executing the grim task of pulling tattered, waterlogged life vests out of the sea. He's hauling up the physical debris of a policy that effectively encouraged tens of thousands of desperate people to gamble their lives on a lethal lie.
So how does he view the 2026 crackdown?
Not as cruelty. In his eyes, it's the exact opposite. It's the first time in recent memory that the EU has stopped acting as an active accomplice to transnational human smuggling cartels.
He sees the policy as saving lives.
He does. He carries the memory of a young man he couldn't pull from the water 3 years ago, a death he attributes directly to the illusion of the open border. And now, watching the new high-tech surveillance buoys flickering on the horizon, signaling that the gate is closed, Elias feels this profound, heavy peace. The era of the West, signaling compassion while counting corpses, is finally ending.
The sea is no longer a graveyard for Western conscience.
Exactly.
And The experiences of Captain Elias provide a real visceral anchor for that sociological concept of luxury beliefs we touched on, which was originally coined by Rob Henderson.
Right, Henderson's work, how does he define it?
He defines luxury beliefs as ideas and opinions that confer significant social status upon the upper class, but at very little, if any, cost to themselves.
Okay, so it's a status marker.
Yes. While the elite gain social capital by holding these beliefs, the beliefs themselves inflict devastating tangible costs on the lower classes and the most vulnerable elements of society.
Like how in the past, status was about expensive physical goods.
Exactly. Tailored silk clothing, pocket watches, those proved wealth. But today, physical goods are too accessible. So the elite transitioned to using ideological positions as their status markers.
Like advocating for defunding the police when you live in a gated community.
Or legalizing hard drugs when you have the money for premium rehab clinics. And in this context, advocating for open borders is the ultimate luxury belief.
And the data regarding the cost of this specific luxury belief is just absolute and uncompromising. I mean, the analysis points to stark numerical realities. In just the first 2 months of the year 2026, the data shows that 655 people died attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea.
That is horrific.
And the standard response from the humanitarian industrial complex, the NGOs, the progressive blocs, is to point to these deaths as indisputable evidence that Europe must create more safe and legal routes.
They argue the deaths are caused by a lack of access.
Right. But the functionalist analysis we're unpacking presents a profound fundamental causal inversion here.
A causal inversion.
It argues that the primary pull factor fueling this relentless death march isn't the lack of safe routes, but the deliberately ambiguous, deeply conflicted border policies maintained by the West over the past decade.
So the ambiguity is the lure.
Yes. The systemic promise of potential asylum, rolling amnesties, NGO rescue ships operating just miles off the North African coast, the eventual access to the welfare state, no matter how faint that chance is.
It acts as an overwhelming incentive.
It incentivizes individuals to hand over their life savings to brutal cartels and board unseaworthy rubber dinghies.
So the luxury belief here is the vocal advocacy for porous borders by elites who want to signal their moral purity.
Right, they get the applause at the charity gala, while the migrants get the rubber dinghy.
That causal inversion is fascinating.
Yeah.
And building on that, we really have to explore the philosophical argument at the core of this diagnosis. The framework posits that true civilizational compassion is fundamentally predicated on clarity, not ambiguity. Yes. A border policy that cannot forcefully, definitively say no ultimately offers nothing meaningful to anyone. It creates a chaotic void.
So universal love isn't healing.
No, the text diagnoses the universal love championed by borderless ideology as an acidic solvent.
The solvent.
It systematically dissolves the specific, localized norms, the civic distinctions, and the binding reciprocal responsibilities that are absolutely necessary for any organized society to function.
And when those are dissolved, you don't get a utopia.
You get systemic chaos, societal enemy, and extreme physical danger. The elite accumulate immense social capital, but the blood debt is paid by migrants on lethal journeys.
And the long-term societal cost is paid by the native working class dealing with degraded social trust.
Viewed through this lens, the severe 2026 maritime reforms represent a necessary return to absolute clarity, closing that deadly, ambiguous gap.
To really crystallize this dynamic, I'm thinking of an analogy. Consider a massive, highly publicized lighthouse.
Okay, a fake lighthouse.
Imagine a coalition of wealthy philanthropists decide to erect this towering lighthouse on a stretch of coastline. They project a brilliant beam far out into the ocean to signal welcoming shores to any ship lost at sea. Right. They throw massive galas, write breathless editorials praising their own compassion. They feel immensely morally superior to the neighboring towns with dark coastlines.
But there's a flaw?
A fatal flaw. They've built this magnificent lighthouse directly over a jagged, highly dangerous submerged reef. The light draws the ships in, but as they approach the sanctuary, their hulls are ripped open by the unseen rocks.
And what do the builders do?
They stand on the balcony, continuing to shine the beam, absolutely refusing to turn it off, because turning it off would damage their carefully cultivated self-image as saviors.
They blame the rocks.
Exactly. They argue the ships are sinking because the rocks are cruel, not because the light drew them there. They ignore the horrific pileup of shipwrecks directly below them, convinced their pure intentions absolve them.
That is a brutal but perfect analogy for the systemic critique of the NGO infrastructure in the Mediterranean.
The 2026 border policies are basically the state stepping in, shattering the bulb of the lighthouse to stop the slaughter.
Yes, because the functionalist argument asserts that the presence of the rescue ships altered the economic calculus of the smugglers.
So,
Because the smugglers knew the NGO ships would rescue the migrants just off the coast of Libya, they started using cheaper, flimsier boats with less fuel.
maximizing profit while drastically increasing danger.
Exactly. The compassion of the NGOs structurally enabled the brutality of the cartels. The 2026 reforms sever that specific economic feedback loop.
Because even if intercepted, they go to a third country hub.
Right. The product the smugglers are selling access to Europe is rendered completely worthless.
Now, we've spent a lot of time on the externalization of the border, the defense of the perimeter, but the analysis makes clear that a wall is only necessary if there is a cohesive society inside worth defending.
The internal operations.
Right. We have to move to how a nation attempts to repair its social fabric. And to understand this internal mechanism, we look to the United Kingdom.
Specifically, the new residency requirements.
Let's look at Elena in a rainy, working-class suburb of Birmingham. She emigrated to the UK a decade ago, established a small bakery, and meticulously learned the local Birmingham dialect.
They're integrated.
Deeply integrated. She's a node of community interaction. But as she stands at her shop window today, she's looking across the street at a storefront that's been shuttered for months.
Because of the 2026 laws.
The business failed because it could no longer source cheap imported labor. The aggressively hiked income thresholds and strict mandatory English proficiency exams hit this neighborhood like a freezing cold front.
It's the uncompromising new social contract.
And Elena knows this intimately because her own cousin recently failed this new meritocratic filter.
Oh.
Yeah. Unable to meet the English requirements and the income threshold, her cousin was forced to return home. Elena feels a profound stinging guilt about it, the emotional burden of the survivor.
There's another side to it for her, isn't there?
There is. When she walks through the local municipal park, she notices a subtle but undeniable shift. The ambient social friction of the neighborhood is fading. People are communicating again.
The identity silos are cracking.
Exactly. She feels the vulnerability of a drawbridge survivor shame that the bridge was pulled up, but simultaneously a fierce, desperate relief that the fundamental social glue of her adopted home is finally being reinforced.
She realizes a society can't function if its inhabitants can't speak to each other in the park.
Right. And Elena's deeply conflicted reality maps directly onto the implementation of the UK government's Restoring Control over the Immigration System white paper,
which became binding law leading into 2026. And to understand the sociological impact, you, the listener, really need to understand the rigorous mechanics of this sweeping reform.
So what exactly changed?
The UK effectively dismantled the previous era of high-volume, low-skill migration. The minimum skill level for a standard skilled worker visa was drastically raised, from an A-level equivalent, basically high school, to RQF level 6, which mandates a graduate level qualification.
That is a massive jump.
And the general salary threshold for a work visa was elevated massively to £38,700 per year.
Wow.
Furthermore, the overseas recruitment route for care workers and junior hospitality staff was completely closed.
Just completely shut down.
Yes. And they restructured the path to permanent residency. The qualifying period for settlement was doubled from 5 years to 10 years under this strict new earned settlement model.
10 years of continuous economic contribution.
Exactly. And perhaps most crucially for the social fabric, the standard of English proficiency required was raised to a B2 level.
So I have to imagine the backlash to this was
Unprecedented. The business lobby issued dire warnings, noting the bureaucratic and salary costs of sponsoring a foreign worker rose to over £14,250.
Which ruins the profit margins for small businesses.
They predicted the absolute decimation of the domestic care, agricultural, and hospitality sectors that had become entirely structurally dependent on cheap, imported labor.
And the political outrage.
Equally severe. Critics compared the Prime Minister's rhetoric about an island of strangers to Enoch Powell's infamous 1968 Rivers of Blood address.
You know, this is precisely where the analysis gets deeply fascinating regarding the macroeconomic trade-off.
So,
Well, you have to ask, how does a modern state justify intentionally inflicting severe financial pain on its own crucial economic sectors?
By cutting off the cheap labor they're addicted to.
Right. A local pub in Birmingham or a care home in Manchester suddenly cannot afford to hire staff because they're legally mandated to pay a £38,700 salary.
It forces a painful restructuring of the domestic economy.
It forces corporations to invest in automation, or it forces them to finally raise wages to a level that will attract the native working class back into those jobs.
So the state is explicitly prioritizing long-term cultural and linguistic unity over short-term economic convenience.
Right. They're deciding that cheaper cups of coffee and higher corporate dividends just aren't worth the complete dissolution of the national identity.
And that is the exact functionalist calculation. The diagnosis views these sweeping UK reforms as a deliberate recalibration of the immigration clause within the social contract.
A return to meritocracy.
Yes. The explicit design is to import individuals who are immediate net contributors to the tax base and social fabric, rather than net consumers of municipal resources.
Because previously, mass migration was used to suppress wages.
The analytical framework argues exactly that. Mass, low-skilled migration was deliberately leveraged by corporate entities to artificially suppress wage growth for the native working class.
By having a limitless supply of labor willing to work for minimum wage.
So corporations never had to raise wages, and this migration served as a convenient metric for the hollow, elite ideological goal of diversity.
Separate from any consideration of economic utility or social cohesion.
Exactly. So in this context, reasserting linguistic commonality and economic self-sufficiency isn't framed as xenophobia.
It's just bare minimum maintenance.
Bare minimum maintenance required to preserve the social adhesive. A calculated resistance against the erosion of trust caused by identity politics and geographic silos.
The state has run the numbers and accepted the massive economic friction as the agonizing but necessary price for repairing the social fabric.
Yes.
Now, we've looked at the external borders in the Mediterranean and the internal economic restructuring in the UK, but to truly understand the sheer scale of what's happening in 2026, we need to broaden the lens significantly.
Look at the underlying demographic physics.
Yes, the deep underlying sociological and demographic physics threatening the evolutionary stability of all Western liberal democracies.
And this draws heavily on the academic analysis from Can Liberalism Last?
Right, because it details how liberal political institutions are currently facing two massive existential crises. These aren't just policy failures, they are structural paradoxes.
What are the two crises?
Rapidly declining social trust and sub-replacement fertility. And the terrifying realization is that the very mechanisms that make liberal democracies economically successful
Are the same mechanisms dismantling their long-term stability.
They are dying of their own success.
And the mechanisms of this decline, as outlined in the academic analysis, center heavily on the sociological impacts of urbanization and the pursuit of capital.
Because liberalism prioritizes individual liberty and free movement.
This economic model naturally pulls massive populations out of stable rural communities and concentrates them into large, hyperdiverse cities.
Which is great for the economy.
Brilliant for the economy. Engines of innovation. But the analysis demonstrates this exact same environment is deeply structurally corrosive to social capital.
And this brings in Robert Putnam's finding.
Yes, Robert Putnam. The text explains the hunkering down effect. Putnam's data revealed that in highly ethnically diverse, densely populated urban centers,
with high transients, people constantly moving.
Right. In those environments, informal social sanctions completely break down.
Because in a small town, you interact with the same people.
You build deep trust, and you punish free riders through ostracization. If you cheat your neighbor, the whole town knows.
But in a massive metropolis, that evolutionary mechanism vanishes.
You're surrounded by strangers you'll never see again. The data shows trust declines dramatically across all groups. People trust their neighbors less, their government less, even their own ethnic group less.
They just withdraw from civic life entirely.
Yes.
And that collapse of social trust in the urban centers collides directly with the second, arguably more fatal crisis, the demographic physics of sub-replacement fertility.
The birth rates are crashing across the West.
Crashing. These wealthy, hyper-liberal societies simply aren't producing enough children to replace their own populations. And again, it's not an accident. It's a feature of the liberal operating system.
Because of the intense prioritization of individual liberty.
Exactly. Maximizing female participation in the corporate workforce, the endless pursuit of career opportunities, diverse lifestyle choices. These inherently conflict with the traditional restrictive norms that historically promote high birth rates.
The economic structures raise the opportunity cost of having children to exorbitant heights.
Housing is unaffordable, childcare is bankrupting, and simultaneously, the cultural structures of liberalism actively remove the intense social pressure to form traditional families.
Society tells the individual their primary purpose is self-actualization, not biological continuation.
Which brings us to a profound, almost tragic irony at the heart of the Western model.
The evolutionary perspective.
Yes. Evolutionarily, the winners in human history are groups who successfully reproduce, expand their demographics, and maintain strict, cooperative group cohesion.
But liberal democracies are structurally handicapped there.
The fundamental paradox is this. Liberalism cannot coercively enforce a fitness-enhancing traditional way of life without immediately violating its own core commitments to absolute freedom and equality.
A liberal government can't legally force citizens to have more children.
It can't mandate church attendance. It can't force cultural homogeneity without instantly ceasing to be a liberal democracy. It's trapped by its own moral parameters.
So we arrive at the ultimate question driving the 2026 policies.
Right. Because liberal democracies cannot force internal demographic growth or mandate traditional cohesion, are they structurally forced to look outward and adopt deeply non-liberal, highly restrictive policies at their borders just to survive?
Right.
I mean, it's offshore border hubs in Albania, the militarization of the Mediterranean, the massive 38,700-pound income thresholds in the UK. These are not liberal policies.
No, they're restrictive, exclusionary, and deeply discriminatory, based on nationality and wealth.
It seems like, to prevent its own systemic suicide, liberalism is essentially borrowing the heavy iron armor of nationalism just to survive the demographic winter. It has to act like a fortress state externally so it can afford to remain a liberal society internally.
That specific tension is exactly what the geopolitical analysis highlights regarding the shifting global balance of power.
How do foreign powers view this?
Well, the text contrasts the paralyzed liberal model with non-liberal, highly religious, or strongly nationalist regimes. These non-liberal societies utilize cultural group selection.
Unabashedly enforcing a strict vision of the good life.
They actively demand and often coerce profound sacrifices from the individual for the collective state. And crucially, they heavily promote, sometimes mandate, natalist policies for demographic expansion.
And strongly cohesive groups can double their populations in a few generations.
They outcompete liberal societies over the long term because they ruthlessly maintain the fundamental evolutionary imperatives of reproduction and extreme in-group cooperation.
While liberalism is ideologically precluded from using any of those survival strategies.
Right. The source text references deep strategic analyses regarding how rival foreign powers view the West. They observe the West's intense obsession with internal historical guilt, endless debates over multiculturalism,
and fracturing internal divisions.
Yes. And they do not view these traits as signs of advanced moral evolution.
They view them as fatal vulnerabilities.
They perceive the systemic breakdown of common national identity as a glaring symptom of terminal internal collapse. They operate on the assumption that liberal societies will eventually succumb to their own paralyzing discord.
Wow.
Therefore, the stringent, unapologetic 2026 immigration reforms represent a sudden, violent recognition of this vulnerability by Western leadership.
A desperate structural attempt to artificially enforce the physical boundaries and social cohesion that liberalism naturally dissolved. Well, the sweeping legislative actions of 2026 really mark the definitive, undeniable bankruptcy of the narrative of progressive inevitability. I mean, for decades, the assumption was that the arc of history bended inevitably toward a borderless, universally integrated global utopia.
But the reality is shifting.
Radically. The West is now violently transitioning from an era dominated by high-minded, universal abstractions into a cold, hard, unyielding diagnosis of societal physics.
The defensive mechanisms we've explored today.
The offshore processing hubs bypassing paralyzed courts, the stringent meritocratic filters prioritizing linguistic and economic cohesion, and the systemic, forceful rejection of elite luxury beliefs. These are the desperate, belated efforts of a civilization attempting to repair its crumbling walls while the storm is already raging.
The overarching macro trend detailed in this analysis reveals a stark reality. The idealized concept of the global citizen is rapidly becoming an artifact of a bygone, opulent, and highly subsidized era. As demographic displacement accelerates, as social trust erodes within urban centers, and as the paradox of anarcho-tyranny pushes domestic legal systems to the absolute brink of failure, the utopian vision of a borderless world is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. In a new age defined by tribal regression, shifting geopolitical power, and fierce zero-sum resource competition, the unyielding physical reality of the fortified nation-state is reasserting itself not merely as a temporary political choice, but as the final, inescapable redoubt of civilization's survival.